Understanding the nature of this competition requires understanding what China wants. If China simply sought to become powerful and not change anything, then the US and China would still compete economically, but there wouldn't be the same level of antagonism and military preparation. More specifically, I'm describing what China's leaders want, so I'll often refer to what the Chinese Communist Party wants, rather than China as an entire nation. That said, I could be even more specific and describe the desires of particular leaders because the CCP itself is a huge organization. But I will use the CCP terminology, even though I really mean the leaders of the CCP, who are the leaders of China. I've categorized the CCP's wants into 15 buckets. These heavily overlap and affect each other. Some may be goals that only matter because they help the CCP achieve one of the other, more fundamental goals. 1. To be respected as a major global power and end humiliations. 2. To become the dominant power in the Asia-Pacific and remove U.S. military influence from the region. 3. To become the predominant global power. 4. To protect its own regime. 5. To continue to develop. 6. To make sovereignty a premier international norm or rule. 7. To de-emphasize human rights as an international norm or rule, or to change the definition of human rights. 8. For socialism and authoritarianism to be legitimated internationally. 9. To influence international institutions. 10. To change international law and norms to its liking. 11. To be preeminent in technology. 12. To control claimed territory. 13. To have influence in foreign countries. 14. To control its own suborder. 15. To end systems of alliances. Number 1. To be respected as a major global power and end humiliations. China is one of the world's great civilizations, one of the world's ancient civilizations. China is the oldest living civilization, with a line from its current nation back to its ancient history. China remembers its history as the one great power of the world and the Middle Kingdom to which all others pay respects. China, the center of civilization and the center of the world. This belief was based partially on ignoring how large the world was, but still, within its region, there was a lot of truth to it. China was the civilizational center of the Far East, the most powerful political unit, and led the world in certain technologies. This all came crashing down when European powers approached a weak Chinese dynasty and carved off pieces of land. During World War II, Japan temporarily took much territory and committed horrible atrocities. Chinese weakness and loss of territory is considered a great humiliation. The CCP wants to return China to its former status. They want China to be powerful and influential. They want previous humiliations ended. Especially since the end of the Cold War, the CCP has strived to return China to greatness. This greatness should not only include hard power, but recognition from the world that China is a major global power and a special civilization. 2. To become the predominant power in the Asia-Pacific. To become great again, China first must become the dominant regional power, with nearby countries subservient, either out of respect, dependency, or fear. The Asia-Pacific region is defined differently in different places. Here, I am referring to countries from India in the west to Japan and Samoa in the east, and from Japan and China in the north to Australia and New Zealand in the south. Including Pakistan and Mongolia would also roughly fit this working conception. Bending a country as large as India to its knees may be unlikely, but China's economic and military power realistically could dominate the rest of the Asia-Pacific. Historically, China was the premier power of their local region. The power of surrounding countries paled in comparison, except a few times when foreign peoples conquered China. But even then, the conquerors didn't add China to the Mongolian or Manchurian empires, but became the new Chinese dynasty. Surrounding nations officially recognize the high place of China. The CCP wants a return to this high place. They want military and economic dominance of the region. China's huge economy makes many local countries dependent on it, and the CCP can use this leverage for control. China has already used its military to take islands claimed by other countries, build islands and seas claimed by other countries, and build military installations on disputed territory. Australia, who heavily exported to China, suffered a Chinese boycott. So, the CCP is willing to use military and economic means to influence its region. Creating a zone of dependence would allow China to prevent a unified front against its territorial claims and any other issue of disagreement. China wants regional predominance, not harmony among equals. China cannot throw its weight around to its fullest extent as long as the United States maintains military power in the region. The smaller countries can use the U.S. to balance against China. The underlying threat that China may use force is weakened when the U.S. may intervene. From Singapore to the Philippines to Taiwan to Japan, the United States has military installations. A major power from across the sea having such power right off China's coast is seen as a continuation of the humiliations. It also limits the extent that China can extend its power into the Pacific, and is a constant threat to trade routes that could be blockaded or interrupted. So, 2. Protect trade routes, extend its power further out, end a humiliation, and be the predominant military in its local region. The CCP wants the U.S. out of its region, which would make China by far the most powerful country and allow it to dominate. China wants U.S. naval and air forces out of the Western Pacific, meaning the South and East China Seas. They see the South China Sea like the Americans saw the Caribbean in the 1800s and early 1900s, an extension of their land territory. Controlling this would allow their navy to focus on projecting power out into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The U.S. wants the Indo-Pacific to have no dominator, and it wants maritime access to remain free. China sees this as a U.S. strategy to maintain military primacy. China wants the people of Asia to find solutions to Asia's problems and to maintain Asia's security. China wants to create security institutions and partnerships to enhance its influence in Asia. They want a security architecture that is exclusively Asian, free of alliances, more focused on domestic security, less liberal, and rooted in Chinese economic power. They also want a security architecture more supportive of CCP ideology and principles. China sees U.S. alliances as not part of the international order, but as part of a strategy to contain China. The CCP weakens the U.S. alliance network where it can. For example, China has become one of Thailand's largest weapons suppliers and a close exercise partner. Additionally, China is promoting Asian institutions that the U.S. has no role in. China's preference for dominance and dependence don't end in the Asia-Pacific, but their interest and relative power are greatest there. So that's where their efforts have gone the furthest. 3. To become the predominant global power. The CCP would prefer not to stop at the Asia-Pacific. While China cannot dominate the world like it potentially can its region, it has the potential to be the number one global power who wields more influence than all other countries. It could become the largest economy, with the best technology, most powerful military, and being the country that leads the formation of international rules. This may sound like a grand ambition, but China already wields much power, and if something happens to the United States, who would stand in China's way? As the greatest and oldest civilization on Earth, the CCP sees it as only natural for China to lead the world. The CCP's goal is to displace the U.S. as the world's top country. The current Chinese leader, Xi, wants to achieve this and other goals so that he can be seen as equal to Mao and Deng. Four, to protect its own regime. From the grandiose desire of becoming the most powerful and influential country on earth to the bare minimal goal of survival. I'm not talking about the survival of China, but the survival of the Chinese Communist Party as rulers of China. The CCP seems well in control, but regimes can end fast, and authoritarians must always be on the watch for rebellion. Much of the CCP's motivation stem from securing its power from both internal and external threats. China has a huge and diverse population. Much of the country is still fairly poor. The Communist Party has little inherent legitimacy. Its legitimacy rests on its promise to improve the lives of its people through economic development and on making China great again, which includes making it a great power and reclaiming lost territory. Externally, China fears direct foreign intervention, as well as influence that could lead its people to question the rule of the CCP. Tiananmen Square, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the easy U.S. victories in the Gulf War and Kosovo shocked China. They feared their own people, they feared U.S. hostility and hegemony, and they feared that the U.S. was trying to overthrow the CCP. They saw the color revolutions and perceived the U.S. as puppet master. Same with the Arab Spring. They believed that the U.S. may do to them what they thought the U.S. did to those countries. It can be argued that the new Cold War with China started with U.S. actions in Kosovo. The military intervention went around the Security Council, was arguably against international law, and was alarming for Russia and China. Some CCP leaders may think that the Cold War never ended, and that the evil, capitalist, imperialist West are coming for the Chinese socialists next. They think that the West is trying to end Chinese socialism and foment unrest. Since the Soviets' fall, the CCP has suspected that the U.S. would use Cold War tactics on it, and has been working to win that war ever since. A part of protecting the CCP is not allowing an alternative, especially a fellow Chinese society that has succeeded in democratic capitalism. If Hong Kong and Taiwan, Chinese societies, can have vibrant capitalist democracies, then why can't all Chinese people? The CCP has to crush Hong Kong and Taiwan because their example as an alternative is a threat to the CCP's hold on power. China's economic development could be threatened by blockade. 1/3 of global trade passes through the South China Sea. 60% of China's trade and 80% of its imports pass through the South China Sea and through the Malacca Strait. A motivation for Chinese power is to protect these trade routes. China's Belt and Road is meant to counter this, creating alternative land routes. The U.S. has military bases in South Korea, Japan, Guam, and Singapore. It operates out of the Philippines, including 3 bases in the north near Taiwan. The U.S., Japan, India, and Australia cooperate to counter China in a system known as the Quad. They have military exercises together and strategize how to defend against China. The U.S. is also working more closely militarily with other countries in the region. China fears that the U.S. is practicing containment and could use its string of military bases to cut China off economically in event of a crisis. Many of the CCP's goals are motivated at least in part by the desire for the CCP to survive. 5. To continue to develop. The CCP wants China to continue its development path into a high-income country. This serves several purposes. 1. It benefits the Chinese people, improving their lives. 2. Development will maintain support for the CCP. 3. A larger economy means more power to influence international relations and to build an advanced military. This is an internal goal, but the development of the country is benefited from outside trade, markets, resources, investment, and technology. So the CCP acts internationally with China's economic development in mind. 6. To make sovereignty a premier international norm or rule. State sovereignty, the idea that each state is the master of its own territory, was the king of the European Westphalian system. Today, it competes with the idea that interfering in another country with military force can be justified. The CCP wants the clear and consistent standard to be that one country can never interfere in the internal doings of another, and foreign invasion is never justified. It justifies its own military actions and plans by claiming that the territory it takes by force is rightfully China's. China wants sovereignty and self-determination to be held sacrosanct. China extols sovereignty whenever it can, insists on it as a bedrock principle of the international system, and influences international institutions to support this principle. They believe in the principle at least partly in order to discourage foreign interference in their partners, and to discourage foreign interference in China itself. 7. To de-emphasize human rights as an international norm or rule, or to change the definition of human rights. To those whose cultures are steeped in human rights, the idea that every human has some sort of unique value seems self-evident. But historically, many cultures have mainly valued their in-groups or /an, not seeing each life as independently valuable. Through a long evolution of Christianity and the Enlightenment, the West has developed the idea that each human has value and is entitled to human rights that supersede any edicts or laws of an earthly government. Western countries don't believe in an obligation to intervene anytime human rights are violated, but can and have used human rights as a justification. The CCP fears that such a justification will be used against China. The invasion of Iraq and the intervention in Kosovo greatly concerned the CCP. They imagine the West doing the same to them. This seems quite unrealistic to me, but even if the intervention was by means other than military, this could damage China. Even criticism of China's human rights record hurts its international legitimacy and soft power, so the CCP tries to stop such criticism. If the human rights regime has less power, then China's influence may increase. The CCP also fears that the Chinese people may demand respect for human rights or democracy. Thus, China does what it can to extol its rejection of human rights. China is against human rights being used to interfere in other countries' internal affairs. Like with sovereignty, China works with like-minded countries and within international institutions to push for limiting human rights. One tact the CCP takes is by changing the definition of human rights. China has spoken against a one-size-fits-all approach to human rights. It wants international human rights law to be state-to-state rather than multilateral, does not want a responsibility to protect individual rights, wants basic human rights to be subject to negotiation and compromise, and wants civil society to play no significant role. So rather than seeing human rights as universal truths, China sees them as negotiable and something that can be violated by states within their own territory. China defines human rights based on social and economic rights. The focus should be on food, shelter, and basic needs, not the luxuries of rights like free movement. China considers colonialism, imperialism, hegemonism, and racism as human rights violations, and is against universal human rights and human rights monitoring. A Chinese understanding of human rights has two categories, individual and corporate. Individual rights are civil, economic, and political entitlements. Corporate human rights are national rights of self-determination and economic development. Individual rights rely on the institutional foundation of corporate rights in order to work. Colonialism, imperialism, hegemonism, and racism deny or oppress a country's statehood and economic autonomy, and therefore are human rights violations. A strong state independent from foreign exploitation, humiliation, and invasion is human rights, because it creates political independence and economic autonomy. This also means that international human rights and humanitarian intervention into domestic affairs are violation of corporate rights. Human rights support state power, rather than limit it. The human rights of individuals are wholly given by the state. China endorses human rights norms, but interprets human rights in a self-serving way. China has joined multiple human rights conventions, but does not enforce them. China wants to change norms and procedures to minimize scrutiny of government's conduct. It also wants to limit the bodies that discuss human rights. China doesn't just want to protect itself from accountability, but other countries too. They want to control research and reports worldwide. China wants to use human rights bodies too, stop their power to challenge China, praise China, and change international norms. 8. For socialism and authoritarianism to be legitimated internationally. The CCP wants the respect of the world, and that is difficult to do when powerful countries look down upon authoritarian governments. The CCP also fears that its people will be influenced by international anti-authoritarian attitudes. Therefore, China works, like it does with sovereignty and human rights, to legitimate authoritarian government, and socialism in particular. The CCP does this with rhetoric and through international institutions, but also takes actions that can support authoritarian governments and undermine democracies. The more authoritarians in the world, the less China can be singled out. The CCP may view this as an ideological struggle: authoritarianism versus democracy, socialism versus capitalism. The world order was made by a democratic country. To protect itself and quasi-allies, China needs to subvert democracy, and especially Taiwan, which is a successful democracy in a Chinese cultural setting. The CCP needs to shape international norms and institutions to legitimize its own system. As it pursues the legitimization of its single-party authoritarianism over liberal democracy, it infuses this difference with its ideas of China's cultural and civilizational superiority. 9. To influence international institutions. To advance their prestige, power, and legitimacy, and to advance the norms of sovereignty, anti-human rights, and authoritarianism, China works hard to influence international institutions and make them work for them, or at least not work against them. China wants more shared control of global governance, less U.S. domination, and to stop Taiwan from acting independently in institutions. China likes neutral institutions that don't push America's liberal agenda or security interest. China supports international institutions aligned with its goals and tries to undermine those that go against its goals and norms. While nationals from different countries are supposed to work for institutions like the UN, WTO, and WHO to advance the goals of those institutions, Chinese nationals work to advance the goals of China. China's influence can be seen in its manipulation of the World Health Organization and to not properly investigate COVID's origins. The WHO didn't simply fail to investigate properly, but repeated Chinese misinformation as China tried to hide aspects of the outbreak in their country. The UN and WHO have also failed to investigate China on other issues. China also uses government-organized non-governmental organizations to spread its norms. They are especially targeting Africa. At the UN, China blocks investigations into both its own human rights violations, but also that of other countries. China has used UN security guards to stop a Uyghur Muslim activist from entering the UN headquarters in New York. It has stopped the accreditation of NGOs that critique human rights. 10. To change international law and norms to its liking. Key norms the CCP wants to change have been discussed, but they would also like, as much as possible, to write their preferences into international law. China wants to rewrite the rules of the international system. The authoritarian government wants to use the rules to further its interests. It doesn't necessarily have a belief in the rule of law. China sees international law as a potential weapon for them to use. China is a part of the UN, including the Security Council, the WTO, the IMF, and other bodies. They have signed thousands of bilateral treaties. Chinese representatives lead several UN specialized agencies. Chinese officials often speak about international law and portray China as its defender and builder. Yet, they remain concerned that international law could be used against China's sovereign interests. China has a mixed record in meeting its international legal obligations, but they are not dismissive of international law. They argue that China complies or is getting there, and try to persuade others to accept their legal positions. They also try to influence non-legally binding norms. China wants to be a part of the global consensus, rather than a spoiler of international harmony. They want to be viewed as a responsible leader of a multilateral order. China tries to adhere to a lot of international law, and often makes excuses to justify their actions under their interpretation of international law, rather than reject the law entirely. Other times, China seems to not enforce rules much at all, like intellectual property, the law of the sea, and human rights. China obeys international rules when practicable, and overlooks them when not. Other countries are often similar in this regard. China doesn't normally openly flout international rules, but China will skirt and sometimes flout to gain competitive advantage. For certain key industries, China seems less concerned about international trade rules. Both the US and China try to adjust international law to make it fit their preferences, or ignore it. Major powers will ignore international law if it goes against a core interest. The US has also ignored, evaded, and rewritten rules when it felt it needed to. International law is often vague and contested, so determining China's compliance can be difficult or misleading. Compliance can be in the eye of the beholder. China has become more bellicose as its power has risen, and it's possible, with its power and view of itself as a great power, it may ignore more international rules. China does not like it when the US acts outside of international law and multilateral mechanisms. However, China would like to have exceptionalism itself. The South China Sea is an example. Ignoring the Permanent Court of Arbitration's ruling in favor of the Philippines, it instead has militarized its disputed claims. Taiwan and the South China Sea are probably special issues and should not be taken as a general Chinese rejection against international law and norms. 11. To be preeminent in technology. Ancient China famously was leaps and bounds ahead of Europe technologically. China wants to return to that world-leading status. To achieve their economic and military goals, China has to be on the bleeding edge of technology. So it has been investing, innovating, and stealing its way to technological prowess. China wants to become a cyber superpower. It wants its technology adopted across the world and its applications used. It often blocks foreign competitors in its own markets, which provide protection to its own technology and helps them control information within China. China wants to be the foremost space power by 2045. They are quickly catching up to the United States. 12. To control claimed territory. The CCP is determined to make good on and maintain its claims in the South China Sea and Taiwan. It has other prominent claims on the border with India and over the Senkaku Islands with Japan. The island claims involve fisheries, oil, and trade routes, so part of China's motivations are economic, but control would also give China military advantages and help it achieve historical claims that have sentimental importance to many Chinese. China sees Taiwan's independence as the West and the US continuing China's humiliation by controlling Chinese territory and threatening China's only coastline. Many Chinese citizens have been so revved up over Taiwan that they expect their government to retake the island, and failing to do so could threaten the CCP's hold on power. So, Taiwan isn't just important to achieve the aspiration of a whole China and an ending of humiliations, but to keep the CCP in power through the legitimacy granted by achieving this nationalistic goal. Control of Taiwan would also give China greater control over the South China Sea, and would make China more technologically advanced overnight. Financially, resource-wise, law-wise, and militarily, China is doing everything one would do if they planned on invading Taiwan soon. Xi repeatedly says he is going to unite China with Taiwan. The chances of China invading Taiwan are very high, and a Chinese victory may not end there. Dominance over Southeast Asia and Oceania may be next. 13. To have influence in foreign countries. To achieve its aims, China wants to have influence in foreign countries in a few areas. It wants access to natural resources, markets, and trade routes. It wants other countries to support its preferred norms and not work against them. The CCP also tries to control the conversation in other countries as it relates to norms and China's other goals. Furthermore, influence across the world is a part of being a great and preeminent power. One project that may produce influence is China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's not clear that Belt and Road's goal is influence in creating dependencies. It may be focused on recycling domestic surpluses into projects that could be productive for recipient states in ways that help China and the recipient. But the cooperation, debt, and general dependence on China related to Belt and Road create influence in recipient countries. Belt and Road gives China leverage to pressure countries to support China's norms and international agenda in international bodies. Belt and Road projects mostly ignore human rights and environmental standards, don't listen to people who may be harmed by the projects, are opaque deals prone to corruption, and have weak labor standards. Belt and Road provides an alternative to Western international development. They don't loan based on the same standards, potentially making them more appealing. The CCP uses whatever leverage it can to influence the conversation in other countries. University administrators and academics have self-censored to avoid angering Chinese officials, and Chinese students have had their families threatened because of what they said in class. Other expats have also had their families threatened. The CCP tries to get digital platforms to censor people who are not in China, and uses market access to force companies to censor. Marriott, Mercedes-Benz, and the NBA have all dealt with Chinese threats. China sanctioned merchandising and broadcast of the Houston Rockets because a team staff member tweeted in favor of Hong Kong democracy. International companies have even fired employees who have expressed views critical of China. The CCP's suppression of speech does not stop at its borders. Other countries often help China by spreading lies and derailing discussions in international bodies by flooding them with bullshit. China can use its economic influence to pressure countries to do such a thing. China has mass media enterprises in multiple languages that spread their pro-authoritarian and anti-democracy propaganda. 14. To control its own suborder. If the CCP can't become the global hegemon or can't significantly change the current order, they may want a partial system instead. This subsystem would be led by China like it was the Middle Kingdom. Others would be in subordination. Such a system would not need to be limited to China's region, but could include up to all of the non-Western world. While China would not have imperial control, it would develop interdependencies with smaller countries and use its economic and military power to have great influence in exchange for political, economic, and security benefits. This would be like a large Chinese sphere of influence. This suborder could be a stepping stone to global hegemony. China could get to global hegemony by starting with its region, then moving worldwide, or it could establish its economic ties across the world and gain power in global institutions. It would not militarily push the US out of East Asia, but would be the leader of economic rules, technological standards, and political institutions. It may be that economic and technological power are more important than military power. Militarily, anti-access/aerial denial may be enough. 15. To end systems of alliances. As discussed in the Asia-Pacific section, the CCP wants to end the U.S. systems of alliances. It envisions a community of common future for mankind and wants to create networks of strategic partnerships and replace the U.S. alliance system. Despite the rhetoric and goal of wanting a world without alliances, China is developing deep ties with Russia, Cambodia, Pakistan, and Iran. Russia, Iran, and China may be forming an anti-US or anti-Western bloc. The various CCP desires are in direct conflict with many US preferences. These could lead to even worse relations or war. The way both countries have identified each other as a chief rival and threat and are acting accordingly makes this a Cold War. But it is not Cold War II because the first Cold War was a Manichaean contest between good and evil where the two sides had directly opposed systems and the communists explicitly wanted worldwide revolution. The Soviet Union threatened a full-scale land invasion of the United States' historical cultural heartland, Western Europe. Every country that turned communist could lead to a series of dominoes that turned the world against freedom. The US-Chinese relationship is tense and covers many issues that could lead to worsening relations or war, but the nature of the struggle is starkly different than that of the Cold War. China wants changes on certain issues, but does not have a long-term goal of overthrowing democracy worldwide to lead the globe in its communist future. The US and China must work to either resolve these issues or to at least not let them spoil the relationship. China is a rival. One competes with rivals, but does not destroy them. Rivals are not enemies. Even if the US tries to limit China's military technology and military reach, the countries are still not diametrically opposed on the world order. The world order may be able to uncomfortably adjust to China's rise without being overturned or without splitting the world into blocks. The United States and China are interconnected countries and peoples that have far more to gain from cooperation than from hot war or Cold War. The U.S. should stand strong and not let China have its way on all of its goals, but should also give China's power the respect it deserves. This is difficult because China makes demands that the U.S. can't assent to, and China likely feels that it is not being respected as long as the U.S. does not give in. For example, having U.S. bases off its coast and the U.S. protecting Taiwan are seen as disrespectful insults to China. So if the only way for China to feel respected is for the U.S. to capitulate, then China won't ever feel respected. Because China threatens to use military force against democracies, steals disputed territory with their military, has no respect for human rights, and may demand more and more influence and power if not halted, the U.S. should stand up to China. This will create tensions and a Cold War-like atmosphere, but doesn't need to devolve into the acrimony and all-out rivalry of the Cold War. The United States has a lot of work to do to limit China's cheating and its military capacity. The U.S. must make itself and its partners strong enough to deter Chinese aggression. Competing in such a competition will not come cheap. Can the American people and the world be motivated to make the sacrifices necessary if not viewed in the light of Cold War? Maybe a Cold War framing will help motivate the U.S. and its partners to deter China. Or maybe such a framing will strike such fear into the Chinese that they'll decide that their only option isn't tense competition with a rival, but outright victory over an enemy. Strategically, Cold War framing could go in either or both directions. Either way, the phrase Cold War is too often misleading because it exaggerates the negativity of current relations. So, for the time being, I will call the relationship a rivalry or competition. Well, I'm Lone Candle, and you can like me, comment me, and love me.